all for coming. It's great to see all of you here. And really, spring is here, and so are you. And we're packed, yeah. I want, first of all, to thank you for coming. And then to remind you to come back on Monday, just as close as that, next Monday, to hear a message of great currency, ISIS in America, from retreat to Iraqi. I know that you've been following the news, and so that you're quite aware of the challenges involved in fighting ISIS. So try to come, because we have someone who's just right for it. Also note that the speaker, in lieu of Dr. Vidini, who had to be out of the country, will be his colleague at George Washington University, Alex Hitchens, who is their research director, and by the way, the son of the late Christopher Hitchens, who spoke here in Scranton very near the end of his life. So now to the present. As many of you know, at the risk of being accused of nepotism, which is, I'm allowed, okay, permission granted, the assignment of introducing my kin to a more objective colleague, to note, and I confess that I'm not totally innocent of showing favor to my relatives, namely Maury and David. But since you haven't complained about my choices, and Ricky has just now given me permission, and in fact you encourage me to engage in this infraction, I may do it again. And Hussein, you're part of the family.
Oh, thank you.
I already consider you in the family, but in the interest of a certain rhythm, I will turn the mic over to Professor Bill Rao to introduce both of you. So please welcome Bill.
I'd like to thank you all for coming to this occasion of public happiness. I realize that there are many kinds of bonds that connect us all, old friends or associates, and we've been together in groups like this before. But I'd like to just say a few words of introduction, if you don't mind. I'll try to be as brief as I can. We're welcoming a new friend as well as an old friend of the University of Scranton and of ours personally back. Our new friend is Dr. Ibish, and he comes from Washington, D.C., where he serves as senior resident scholar in at the Arab Gulf States Institute and as senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine, and where he has authored several articles and stood for Charlie Rose's interview, for example, or on topics such as violence against Arab Americans, or the troubled one-state solution that we've been hearing about or discussing quite a bit. In any case, we'd like to welcome him back. This is his second trip and visit, and he hails from Beirut, Lebanon, where his father taught at the American University, and where the university has other friends who have visited and spoken at this university and offered students short courses on the history of Islam. And of course, our old friend, David Myers, who is the Sady and Ludwig Kahn Chair of Jewish History as of 2015, Mazel tov, my friend, and who has served as the Chair of History at UCLA, as well as the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies. His connection to the university certainly predates mine. He spent his senior year here at the university before going on to Yale, Tel Aviv, Harvard, and ultimately Columbia. And our paths crossed in '95, I think it was. So we've opened our third decade of friendship, of sincere regard, trust, and affection. He's the author of several books. I would like to put it in context here. His Reinventing Jewish History is a reflection from a philosopher's point of view on the power of an event to revise our sense of the past. And of course that brings us here. And so I think I should skip my other highfalutin comments. I wanted to talk a little bit about this problem, but it's not my place. So anyway, welcome again. Thank you all, and I hope you're feeling the public love the way I am.
Thank you so much, Bill. Bill mentioned that he's going to have to leave to teach a class at 1 o'clock on the topic of boredom. And my sincere hope is that we do not give you much material to work with in advance of the class, Bill. It's a great pleasure to be back here. It's a great pleasure to share the stage once again with my friend Hussein Ibish. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Good. I want to open up by reiterating something that you may not have in the form on the tip of your tongues and in the uppermost parts of your brain, which is the method that we have developed over the course of our time together. Hussein and I taught a really extraordinary adult ed course last fall. That's fall 2016, 15. And we've been appearing in settings like this ever since, sporadically when our schedules permit. And we've sort of developed a method, an underlying philosophy of what we do. The method is to bring into conversation two competing narratives. The narrative that Jews, and more particularly Zionists, tell about their relationship to the land of Israel, and the narrative that Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs, tell about their relationship to Palestine. We believe that embedded in those narratives is a lot of fiction, but also a lot of truth. Indeed, what is confounding, really vexing about this problem, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is that both narratives contain a good deal of truth. And in fact, more than that, both narratives embed within them a good deal of rights. That is to say, there are real rights that inform the Jewish historical experience as reflected in the Zionist effort in Palestine. And there's a great deal of underlying right in the Palestinian claim to that same territory. And so we're faced with a difficult situation. What do you do when you have competing and, in some sense, irreconcilable truths and narratives that don't yield to an easy resolution? All the more so when you have rights involved. How is it that you could have a right and another right, and they seem to represent a zero-sum proposition? We don't have, at least not today, the ultimate answer to this question. But we do believe that there's real value in bringing together the narratives, to investigate them together. We believe that that leads to a much richer historical picture. I myself can never teach the history of Zionism again without teaching it together with the history of Palestinian nationalism. It would seem to be dishonest to the historical record and just a figment of the ultimate historical experience that we're trying to capture as historians to do so. But there's another value beyond accuracy in the historical record, and that is we believe that through this exposure to dual or multiple narratives, history can help to humanize, can advance the goal of humanizing the other. It's not just important for the two of us, it's important for all of us. And I dare say it's important for Israelis and Palestinians to be exposed to the historical experience of the other. In that sense, history is an important tool of reconciliation. And so we come here today both to serve the purpose of promoting a richer and more robust understanding of history, but also to promote a larger goal, which is the kind of understanding that comes from that expanded sense of historical perspective. Today, we're going to offer the second piece in what we imagine to be a three-part series. I guess it depends on how it goes today, whether or not we'll be invited back. I know some people in positions of influence here, so perhaps we have a chance for that third return visit, which will really deal with the last decades of the conflict up to the present. Feel free to ask questions about where things are today, but we want to talk about the second phase in the conflict as we see it. The first phase is what we covered last time we were in town, which was the origins of the conflict from 1882 to 1948, the phase that entails a struggle between Jews and Arabs over that land with many names: Canaan, Philistine, Palestine, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, Israel. Today we want to talk about the second phase in the conflict, a phase in which Israel faces off against the surrounding Arab world, its neighboring Arab states. That's phase two in the conflict. That's a state-based conflict, and very different, therefore, from that which preceded it, when you had two groups struggling for recognition as nations, aspiring to the status of a state. One of them succeeded in that first period, the other did not. By virtue of the fact that the other did not, the Palestinians, they were, in a certain sense, born as a nation. It was the searing experience of not only being denied a state, but being forced to leave, the experience of dispossession, that lent a definitive sense of identity to the Palestinian people. And ironically enough, it's at that very point that the Palestinians, in a certain sense, disappear from the scene of history for the period we're going to be talking about. So let us just begin by reviewing where we're at. Forgive my numbering system, which is somewhat primitive, but it's not math education in Scranton, I can assure you. I did get beyond one. So we're going to be looking at the second phase in the conflict, the Arab-Israeli, roughly from 48-49 to 79. If and when we come back, we'll talk about the third phase, which is when the Palestinians reemerge on the stage of history, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And one question that animates and in some sense haunts us is whether or not we've entered in a new phase of the conflict, which is the conflict between Muslims and Jews. You want to say anything at this point?
No.
Okay. All right. So we're going to just take one step back before we forge forward to establish a baseline. We concluded last time by talking about the Battle of 1948 between Jewish and Arab forces, the battle that breaks out in the days immediately after the United Nations General Assembly passes a resolution endorsing the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. One of the things we notice is that as those hostilities break out, the Arab urban elites take leave of Palestine, depriving the Palestinians of a natural leadership cohort. That conflict that takes place between local Arab and Jewish forces reaches a certain turning point in April of 1948, when one of the most infamous episodes in the history of Jewish military activity in Palestine occurs on the 9th of April, when fighters from one of the Jewish paramilitary groups associated with the revisionist Zionists engage in what is a massacre of civilians in the village of Deir Yassin, just outside of Jerusalem. We're not going to go into details about it, but it represented a significant turning point in that it induced very considerable panic and fear in the Palestinian Arab population. In the sort of constant logic of the conflict, it of course led to a reprisal strike, a murderous attack upon a convoy of largely Jewish doctors and nurses, with some professors making their way to the Hebrew University and Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus 4 days later, in which 80 people were killed. So this was very much a part of the rhythm of activity, of military activity, of violence in Palestine in this era. But what's important to note is that in early April we see a shift and an acceleration of the flight of Palestinians from their homes that brings us up to May, when, on the eve of the expiration of the British mandate, the Jewish political leadership in Palestine decides that the time has come to declare the formal establishment of the State of Israel, late afternoon just before the Jewish Sabbath, May 14, 1948. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Zionist organization in Palestine, declares the official founding of the State of Israel. The next day, 5 surrounding Arab countries send their armies to attack the new state, leading to the second phase in the conflict, which lasts for another half year or so, in the course of which the Jewish and then Israeli forces use their qualitative and, as we now know, quantitative advantage to win the battle. And this brings us to the consequences of the Battle of 1948.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth pointing out that also in April of 47, the Jewish armed forces launched Operation Dalek, Plan Dalek, which involved seizing a good deal of strategic territory and in the process removing the inhabitants. So a good deal of the forced expulsions happened around then. I think it's important to note to understand how the Palestinians received this experience, that whether they fled or were expelled, they all expected that this would be a matter of days or weeks. It didn't occur to them, and I've met hundreds of people who experienced that at various ages of their lives, and they all thought they were just getting out of the way of the war. It never occurred to them that they wouldn't go home, and of course they never did. And so I think this map roughly shows basically what happened. The bottom line is that before this conflict in 47-48, there was a robust and extant Palestinian society in most of what became Israel, and after the war it was simply gone. It had vanished in every possible way, with some remaining pockets, but as a society, as a nascent country and whatnot, it had simply gone. And the consequence of this for Palestinians is that first, their national institutions were totally obliterated, right? I mean, they came out of this experience with nothing of a national nature, number one. And number two, their focus had to shift onto maintaining sustenance for themselves and their families. And this sort of solidified and introduced the golden age of education for Palestinians that went straight through to the beginning of the first Intifada. And maybe when we come back we can talk about what that did to the Palestinian attachment to education, which was quite serious. But you do get a sense here of what sort of disintegrated in the process.
So there was a great deal of indignation that greeted the United Nations partition plan, indignation on the part of Palestinians. And then there was a sense of catastrophic loss that followed on the dispossession of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in 1948.
One of the participants here asked me to mention something that apparently we didn't mention last time, which is part of the indignation was that and apparently we overlooked this last time we were here, that the proposed Jewish state in the UN partition plan had more Arabs in it than Jews. In other words, it wasn't possible to gerrymander a Jewish majority state in 1947 Palestine. And I was chided for not having pointed that out last time, so I'll point it out now. The entire experience of partition was one of kind of outrage on the part of a people who were convinced that a country couldn't be divided, couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't, and mustn't be divided against the wishes of its large majority. But of course, it can and was.
So just to remind ourselves, demographically, there are about 1.3 million, 1.2, 1.3 million Arabs in Palestine in 1948, about 650,000 Jews.
Right.
The United Nations partition plan granted 55% of the land to the Jewish state, 45% to the Arab state. And that helps us understand the sense of indignation. And what I want to convey to us is there's a great deal of truth in the experience of Palestinians who felt indignation. One can readily understand why they would be upset, why there was a real sense of incredulity at the United Nations partition plan. And I want us to hold on to that for just one brief second, because it's also very important to understand why there was a sense of absolute exhilaration on the part of the Jewish population of Palestine. Remember that the United Nations activities with respect to Palestine didn't just follow on the expiration of the British Mandate. More significantly, they followed on the full exposure of the enormity of the tragedies suffered by the Jewish people in the Second World War. The murder of some 6 million people. So there was a very palpable sense on the part of those Jewish fighters in 1948 that they weren't simply fighting for the success of Zionism or for the creation of a Jewish state, but for the survival of the Jewish people. One can, and I think one must understand, that sense of exhilaration.
No, it's interesting. When I was a child in the 60s in Beirut, I was frequently exposed to the idea that Palestinians were the final and secondary victims of the Holocaust. That, in other words, without that, the State of Israel wouldn't have been, this wouldn't have happened, etc. It sounds ridiculous at this point, but it seemed logical at the time.
Well, I'm haunted by a phrase in one of the great, perhaps the great novel of the Palestinian catastrophe of 1948, the Nocte, which is the Lebanese writer Elias Khouri's Gates of Sun, where he refers to the Palestinians as the Jews' Jews.
Yeah.
A very haunting phrase that I think captures what Hussein just mentioned.
That's the idea.
But what I want us to hold on to is the sense of utter catastrophe and indignation and exhilaration on the other hand. And it's not as if we can easily assume that one trumps the other.
Yeah.
They're both understandable and valid experiences. In the case of the Jews, this was a fight for their very survival, cast as such, in the face of what was perceived to be a uniformly hostile world. One heard at various points calls by Arab leaders for the extermination of the Jews that, as you might imagine, triggered that sense of trauma that had been induced just a few years earlier in the Holocaust. One thing that's also important to note is that there was a very significant dispossession that took place in Palestine. Around the same time, there was also another important population movement of Jews from Arab lands, Jews who had been encouraged, invited, forced to leave, whose land had been expropriated, on the order of some 850,000 people, many of whom made their way to the newly created State of Israel. Some have suggested that this was, in a certain sense, a wash, that they're more or less equivalent numbers, and that makes it a kind of even historical account. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, and we can talk about it.
It doesn't square well with Zionism. So, I mean, a Zionist narrative would hold that's where they belong.
Right.
So, I mean, either they belong there or it can't be both a tragedy and a realization at the same time. That's a little weird.
Right.
Anyway.
Good point. We can go back to this. I mean, it's a complicated question that deserves more attention. One thing I want to just call attention to in conclusion is that there was a very high motivation on the part of Jewish forces, particularly in light of the Holocaust. And this leads to another really central point, which is to say that that trauma has been an animating force in Israeli political culture ever since.
Right.
That trauma, that fear of extermination. And it wasn't just that fear in isolation. So too the Palestinians have been animated and informed and plagued by the trauma of what is known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. I don't want to equate the two events in scale or scope, but I do want to suggest that they have created deep reservoirs of an ethos of victimization that has really animated and informed both groups, and that I think is a very, very disabling factor in the hope of resolving the conflict. Okay. Let's just sort of put the question squarely. Who is David and who is Goliath in this formative battle coming out of 1948? And the fact is, both groups believe themselves to be David and the other to be Goliath. The Jews were a beleaguered minority who had suffered grievous losses in the previous 5 years. They believed that they had proceeded as you should proceed, They had gotten international validation by the League of Nations and then the United Nations. They had worked assiduously to build up a national infrastructure. And if they didn't deserve a place under the sun, then who did? Right? So this is how they understood it.
Yeah, and I think for Palestinians, they felt very much beset by a series of oppressors, from the Ottomans to the British to the Zionists, and backed up by the West for the most part. And I think the basic sense that they had was that while maybe they hadn't performed as well as they might have, that in the end there wasn't anything they could have done. And I'm not sure they're wrong about that. I'm not sure that had they played their cards differently, the outcome would have been all that different for them. I don't want to take away their agency, and I don't want to give a sense that that sometimes they fall victim to, where they kind of think that they are just victims and they need to get their rights given to them on a silver platter, and it doesn't matter what they do or they don't do. That's not right at all. But I do think when you go back and look at kind of the array of forces that were assembled in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and you ask yourself the question, could the Palestinians have prevailed under any circumstances? I'm not sure the answer is yes. And I'm not sure the outcome would have been much prettier for them. And so then, of course, they always ask themselves, why us? Why Palestine? What happened here? We were just farming our lands and not doing anything, and this just kind of whirlwind came upon us, and that's the way they experienced it. They weren't ready for it. They barely understood what was happening to them by the time it did happen, and particularly when we talk about at the village level and the peasant level, I think they really barely had a sense of what was going on before it was upon them. You know, they felt very strongly that they were never offered a reasonable accommodation by anybody. And finally, I think there's very much a sense in which they, throughout this whole process, were struggling to define themselves as a people. And were kind of defining themselves in a very reactive way to everything that was going on around them. And as David noted, it's precisely this experience of dispossession and exile that marks them as irretrievably different from the other Arabs. It's an experience that the other Arabs don't share, and that's unique to them. And there's a whole series of subsequent experience that is unique to them and that marks them as permanently different and as Palestinian as opposed to anything else.
Okay, we're going to move ahead. In the wake of the armed conflict between Israel and the Arab states, and before that between Jews and Arabs, there was a series of negotiations brokered by the newly established United Nations, led by a UCLA alumnus, Dr. Ralph Bunche, that brought together the warring parties through an indirect process of negotiation that yielded an armistice, a cessation of hostilities. And that, the resulting armistice line has come to be known as the Green Line. It is what demarcated Israel from the west bank of the Jordan River. And you can read here what this line was understood to be, not as a political or territorial boundary. It is delineated without prejudice to rights, claims, and positions of either party to the armistice.
It's a ceasefire.
As regards ultimate settlement of the Palestine question. Sorry?
It's a ceasefire.
It's a ceasefire. It's a ceasefire. And yet, over the course of time, it has been, it has emerged as really the baseline for all negotiations that have taken place up to this point. Whether that will continue into the future is an interesting question. And here's where we really come to that point that I hinted at earlier that's of such significance. To a great extent, the events of 1948 gave birth to a very powerful sense of Palestinian national identity. And yet, the Palestinians will now disappear from the stage of history for a number of decades as the conflict becomes defined, in part through this armistice process, as a conflict between states, between the new state of Israel and its surrounding Arab neighbors. Okay, we're going to push ahead, and I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that Israel faced in the 1950s. First of all, just to give a demographic sense, at the first census undertaken by the new state of Israel, there are 800,000 residents enumerated, of whom 156,000 were Palestinian Arabs. So we're talking about a very small percentage of the population, of the Palestinian Arab population that had dwelt in lands that the state of Israel now claims. We think about 700 to 750,000 who lived on these lands left or were expelled.
Mostly left in Galilee.
Yeah. In addition, there were another 30,000 or so internally displaced persons who had no place to settle. They had been displaced from their homes and had no legal residence. That sort of added to the chaos of the early years. One of the things that's noticeable in the first actions of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is that differential pathways to citizenship were introduced. Jews were given the right, whether they were in Palestine or not, to have an expedited path to citizenship. This was through the 1950 Law of Return, which grants any Jew in the world the right to pursue an expedited pathway to citizenship. Whereas in the Citizenship Law of 1952, new obstacles were placed in the path of residents of Palestine who had left during the armed hostilities, principally referring to Palestinian Arabs who had been displaced and were now trying to come back. This process of being displaced and trying to come back led to a phenomenon that's known in Israel as infiltration. A small number of the infiltrators were intent on committing terrorist acts. A much larger number of the infiltrators were intent on returning home to their place of residence, which very often had been possessed anew by Jewish residents. So we know not only that homes were taken over, Palestinian homes were taken home by Jewish citizens of the new state, we also know that hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages were essentially either razed or simply renamed, or both. This made for a very difficult predicament for those who did remain, those Palestinians who did remain, who fell immediately upon the creation of the state under the control of a military government. From 1948 to 1966, Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel were under the control of the military government.
Martial law.
Pardon me?
Martial law.
For all intents and purposes, martial law. It's important to note that Israel, from its first days, lived in a state of emergency, which formally exists until the present, and can be triggered. It has been triggered in a number of dire security situations, but also in labor disputes. When the government has felt it needs to get workers back to work.
But that's true of the Arab states. Almost all of them still invoke pre-independence British or Ottoman emergency provisions. Israel too. They all do.
Yeah. The state of emergency is very much an indication of the legacy of British mandatory rule. British mandatory emergency regulation 1945 was incorporated by the Knesset in one of its first legislative acts.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of Carl Schmitt. Nothing's temporary.
Carl Schmitt.
Everything's permanent.
The state of emergency.
Yeah.
So
what
it meant to live under military rule is that there were restrictions on travel outside of your area of residence. There were laws against free assembly, and there were administrative detentions and even expulsions. And this had the effect, to a certain extent, of stifling the growth of any independent Palestinian nationalist sentiment for the Palestinian population of Israel.
To be clear, it was quite illegal to express any Palestinian national sentiment. I mean, you go to jail right away. That's simple as that.
Unless you expressed it in one vein, and that was as a member of the Communist Party.
Yeah, you could do that.
The Communist Party
that was all right.
Was permitted to send representatives to the Knesset. It was divided between Jewish and Arab members. It had its own newspaper that gave voice, one of the few legal outlets to give voice to Palestinian national sentiment, of course wrapped in a communist idiom, that marvelous act of trying to square the circle of socialism and nationalism, communism and nationalism in this case. But this was one of the important features of Israeli political culture in the 1950s, as well as an important demographic strain. Another important strain relates back to that act of flight of 850,000 Jews from Arab lands who make their way to Israel. And their integration into the new Jewish state is very difficult because they bring with them a culture very different from that of the dominant Ashkenazic elite, the dominant elite of Eastern European origins. And many of the new arrivals are placed in transit camps where they really undergo a kind of process of re-education. That process of re-education and the experience in the camps engenders already in these years a certain resentment that actually led to violent outbursts from time to time. One famous episode is in a Haifa neighborhood of Wadi Salib in 1959. It's important to note that resentment also informed the creation of an Israeli Black Panther Party in the 1960s. I mention this because it's going to return to our story in about 30 years. Want to say something about this?
I'll come back to it.
Okay, so I just also, along with all of these very complex demographic problems that the new state of Israel is facing internally, it has a potentially hostile Palestinian population, and it has to absorb hundreds of thousands of immigrants who come from a very different cultural universe than the dominant elite. It's also important to note that Israel is integrating tens and then hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors. So you have this rather remarkable mix of peoples, which create serious problems in terms of creating a unified culture. Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of the new state, introduces a concept he calls mamlachtiyut, statism. The state must stand above all, not inconsistent with the idea of a state of emergency. We must put aside our differences, the differences that separated one Zionist faction from another, one ethnic group from another. The state is the preeminent institution in Israeli society. That state and Israeli society at large lived in constant fear, no doubt exacerbated by the trauma of the Holocaust, of a second round, sibuv sheni, of a war with the Arab countries, whose rhetoric very often was quite shrill, even blood-curdling, in describing the nature of the Jewish threat. And so there was a constant fear that informed Israel in the 1950s that it would be subject to a massive attack by its Arab neighbors.
Here I can chime in, for sure. The basic sense in the Arab world, I think in the early to mid-50s, was one of disbelief. Disbelief that this could have happened, a disbelief, really literal disbelief that it would last, a sense that this was a very temporary thing, and that once the Arab states were consolidated their independence and got their act together, they could reverse this tragedy and travesty of 1948, restore the Palestinians, find some kind of reasonable accommodation, and undo the injustice of 1948. The Palestinian national life starts, the sparks begin to flicker in the refugee camps, and you start to get the beginnings of a kind of armed movement again, these infiltrators that you were talking about, the Fedayeen, very much operating under the aegis of the Arab governments, but beginning to reconstitute the origins of Palestinian national institutions again. It's not there yet at all, but it's something rather than nothing.
Right. I just want to add that Israel senses its profound isolation in the region and is fearful of a second wave of attacks. like the attacks of May 15th, 1948. And it seeks allies in the world. It imagines that it might be at home in the alliance of non-aligned countries, but that doesn't prove to be particularly receptive. It's important to note that the United States is not Israel's chief ally in the world at this time. The country that perhaps most helped Israel gain a qualitative advantage in the war of 1948 was Czechoslovakia, of all countries. And that probably has to do with the fact that one of the great founding fathers of Czechoslovakia, Thomas Masaryk, felt a great affinity for Zionism, and particularly for the cultural Zionism associated with a man called Echad Am. In the 1950s, Israel's chief ally in the world are the French, chief supplier of military armaments and materiel. And this becomes relevant when we make our way to 1956, and the Suez Crisis emerges. Israel finds the Egypt of Gamal Abdel Nasser to be its chief threat, and engages in a series of discussions with the British and French to undertake a preemptive strike to assure that the Suez Canal, that essential passageway of commerce, remain open, which it does in October.
Well, right. What happened is that Nasser, when he consolidated power in Egypt, became a great kind of nationalist demagogue and seized upon the struggle with Israel as a kind of nationalist rallying cry. The other big nationalist rallying cry was the Suez Canal, which he threatened to nationalize and eventually did nationalize, to the enormous rage and consternation of the British and the French.
Right. Who see a vested interest in liberating it, together with the Israelis, leading to the strike. Thank you for that clarification. In the wake of the Suez War, the United Nations places emergency forces in the Sinai Desert to serve as a kind of buffer between Israel and Egypt. This will become important to our story in 1 second.
Well, it's definitely worth pointing out that at the end of that war, the gains of the British, Israelis, and French were reversed at the insistence of the United States. I mean, that's sort of an extraordinary moment, and really takes you back to a different era.
A different era. UAR?
Yeah. What happens, I mean, we can talk about this rather briefly, but there was a big push for Arab nationalism in the aftermath of this sort of salvage success, a short-lived political union between Egypt and Syria that couldn't really be realized because essentially Syrians didn't want to be ruled by Cairo, which is essentially what would have happened, I think. And there was a kind of very, strong Egyptian heavy-handedness in dealing with the Syrians, which didn't go over very well. And this was another blow to pan-Arab nationalism. But you've also got the emergence of two competing camps which start to define the Middle East in its global arrangements. The emergence of a pro-Soviet Egyptian-led camp and a pro-American Saudi-led camp, and the emergence of what's called the Arab Cold War, and a kind of split in the Arab world between a kind of pro-Soviet and pro-American camp. And the only thing the two camps agreed on was Israel, but they really didn't cooperate very much on that, and not at all anything else. Open warfare in Yemen. And the sides also, as this graphic points out, defined largely on the one hand by revolutionary republics versus conservative monarchies. And that even echoes to this day, I think. Revolutionary republics versus conservative monarchies, if you think about the Gulf region. You know what I'm talking about. And they did agree on the need to confront Israel, but not on much else. And I think the Yemen war, which was a huge debacle for Egypt, and right now could be said to be a debacle for Saudi Arabia, although less so for the United Arab Emirates in the south, might be seen as kind of a replay of that. Maybe it's not a great place to go adventuring. But the war in Yemen actually did have a really big impact on the next big thing that happens. So let's bear that in mind.
Okay, I just want to sort of pause to reflect where we're at in the 1950s, Israel remains an inexplicable presence and an irritant in the midst of this Arab world. Meanwhile, from Israel's perspective, it seeks to establish what it regards as a legitimate presence, internationally recognized, in the midst of this sea of Arab hostility. So that's sort of where we're at as we make our way into the 1960s. Oh, but first we're going to talk about formal steps to establish a Palestinian. So the Palestinians are going to return to our story in part.
A bit, yeah.
A bit.
I mean, you have the beginnings of the restoration of Palestinian national institutions in 1964, very much under the aegis of the Arab states, and particularly Egypt. The first Arab League summit in Cairo sets the stage for this. That sets the stage for the convening of the first Palestinian National Congress in Jerusalem under Jordanian auspices in May of 1964, adopts a very absolutist version of the Palestinian National Charter, founds the PLO under Ahmed Shukayri, who became the first chairman of the PLO. And again, it's what they agreed on was a very absolutist document, which basically said that Palestine was Arab, part of the Arab League, and that basically the Jews who had arrived after the advent of colonization, was very vague, would have to go essentially. And it was a very extreme document. Also thoroughly endorsed armed struggle as the path forward. So it's very much a reflection, I think, of the agenda of the Arab states, again, still hoping to go to war to reverse the 1948 outcome, rather than anything independently Palestinian.
I'm curious about your sense of how sincere the commitment of the Arab states was at this point or even earlier to the Palestinian cause.
Well, I think it's hard to say. I mean, I think it depends on which state and when, and I think there's a difference between a kind of generic, let's say, morale-based commitment and national interests. And so I think that states often operate at both levels simultaneously. At the level of national interest, they're always looking out for what they can get out of the situation and are very much manipulating the Palestinian issue. I think there's a real case to be made that before 1948, the Jordanian monarchy had done a deal with the Israelis not to go into any of the areas the UN had reserved for the Israelis, and only to fight over Jerusalem and other contested areas. And if you look at the map of where they fought and when, that seems to be what happened. So possibly it goes back even as far as that. And I do think it's impossible to look at this history without saying that each of these states is trying to position itself within this issue for its maximal advantage. That doesn't mean they don't care about this at all, but it does mean they have their own interests first, which is not unusual.
Yeah, I just want to go back and sort of reiterate a point that Hussein made about
worth making.
This informed speculation that in the midst of the hostilities of 1948, 1949, there were back-channel negotiations between the new state of Israel, represented by Golda Meir, and King Abdullah, the king of Jordan, the grandfather of the current king, in which they essentially agreed to divide the terrain and set the rules for armed conflict, delimiting it so as to incur no damage to either of their own sides, but significant damage to the Palestinian cause.
Exactly. Yeah. To fight over areas reserved to the Palestinians.
So here, I don't know if you want to say anything more about the Palestinian National Charter.
Well, I think we've kind of pointed out how maximalist it was in its first iteration. It sort of talked about a Palestinian personality as if it was some essential thing. That Palestinians were an inseparable part of the Arab nation, so there's a bigger part of which it's a bigger whole of which it's a part. Denied that Judaism was a nationality, only a religion. Denied the historical claims between Jews and Palestine, and said that Jews of Palestinian origin are considered Palestinians only if they're willing to live peacefully and loyally in Palestine. So it's all very conditional and very absolutist and extreme.
One of the things we see here is the beginning, or I should say the enshrinement of a trope of denialism.
Yeah, well,
which is one of the recurrent features in the conflict on both sides. So
it's the enshrinement. These are ideas that had been present for a long time, but this is putting them in writing.
So, yes, and the idea I'm going to talk about has long roots extending back to the late 19th century. Judaism is not an independent nationality. The claim that Jews constitute a nation is an historical fiction, according to this view. By the way, we see traces of that back into the early 20th century, late 19th century, and we hear it today.
Yeah.
And it has a parallel on the Jewish side as well. And this is part of the way in which history can be used not as a tool of reconciliation, but as an instrument of vilification, this kind of denialism. It's interesting to juxtapose that to a text with which you're all familiar, of course, from our last time here, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which in a certain sense performs a similar move, but reverses the victim, as it were. And this time it's the British who do the job. So as you can see by looking at the words in italics, and this was the document by which the British government sort of indicated its favorable disposition to the Zionist movement, it casts the Jews as a nation by referring to their right to a national home, whatever that actually means, but nonetheless uses the language of nation, but does not accord that same designation upon those described as the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. That is to say, the people who represented 90% of the population of Palestine. So that kind of play, denying back and forth, is a recurrent feature.
Another distinction. The Jewish people have rights to a national home, whatever that is. The non-Jews in Palestine, the big majority, not only do they not have an identity apart from the fact that they're non-Jewish, they have civil and religious rights, which are individual rights. Everybody has civil and religious rights, but only collectivities have national rights. Right. So again, they're denationalized in this formulation.
So I just want to call our attention again to this here. We see it here as well. And that's a constant feature of this conflict, that culture of denialism. Okay, let's move our way into the 1960s as we make our way sort of towards conclusion. The 1960s witnesses yet another growth spurt demographically for the state of Israel, which moves from its original population of 800,000 to almost 3 million in 1965 or so. Israel has become a technologically advanced society. One of the great, albeit secret, achievements of its technological advance is the development of atomic weapons at the Dimona plant. If anybody wants to read about it in a kind of popular form, have a look at Ari Shavit's book, The Promised Land, where there's a chapter devoted to Dimona. So Israel is in a real growth spurt, both demographically and technologically, and yet there's a certain sense of malaise in the mid-60s, a sense that the guiding ideological spirit of Zionism, which sought to create a Jewish homeland after millennia of suffering and exile, had sort of waned, that a sense of mission had been lost. And it's precisely in this period that we begin to hear increased and escalating rhetoric from Israel's persistent nemesis and neighbor, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, who undertakes a number of threatening acts in May of 1967. First, calling for the withdrawal of the United Nations emergency forces that were set in place in the Suez crisis, which he had the right to do.
And they were withdrawn.
And second, closing the Straits of Tiran. So another action designed at gaining control over the narrow passages of commerce, which were essential to Israel's economic and general political well-being. In response to those two actions, which really reignited the fear in Israel that Nasser was trying to hold true to his rhetoric to throw the Jews into the sea, Israel, in early June 1967, undertakes a lightning strike at its chief Arab adversaries, particularly the Egyptians, whose air force was entirely obliterated in a matter of hours on the 5th of June 1967.
On the ground. I mean, wiped out on the ground.
Wiped out on the ground without ever taking off.
Just
without ever
like
taking,
a
without ever getting a plane off the ground. In addition to,
it shows how ready they were.
in addition, and it was an experience learned, as we'll see.
Yes, indeed.
As we'll see presently.
Oh yes.
In addition, Israel makes significant advances on the ground, moving into the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Desert, both of which were controlled by Egypt, and proceeding as well into the eastern half of Jerusalem, as well as the west bank of the Jordan River and the Golan Heights in the northeast part of the country, in a war that in total lasts 6 days, which of course lends that conflict its very name, the Six-Day War. A major turning point in the conflict, a major turning point in really the unfolding evolution of the conflict. It induced in Israel a sense of miracle, certainly amongst the Jewish population, and I should say not just in Israel, throughout the Jewish world, throughout the Jewish diaspora. There was a sense that a nearly inescapable tragedy had been averted. That sense of trauma reared its head again in the months leading up to June 67. And then there was a sense of absolute exhilaration and exuberance, a resurgence of ethnic pride, and I should add, a very palpable sense of messianic expectation and passion. Many Jews felt that Israel's victory in the 1967 war was an act of divine intervention. The resonant phrase that was heard, that became sort of the famous slogan in Israeli. One of the most famous phrases in Israeli history is when Colonel Mota Gur announced over the radio that Har Habayit biyadenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands. We have regained control over the Temple Mount, including access to the Western Wall, known as the Kotel. This instilled very deep pride in Israel that there was a kind of historical reconciliation underway as Israel the new reconnected with Israel the old. It was also a defining moment in modern Arab political history.
Yeah, to say the least. It's really a turning point in the Arab world. And first of all, it takes everything that the Palestinians had experienced in 48 and doubles down on it. You have an additional 300,000 refugees created largely through expulsions from East Jerusalem and the West Bank in this war. But in addition, the sense of failure, of abject humiliation, of total defeat, of shock, of an inability to comprehend that this could happen again and get even worse, I think was a trauma that the Arab world is still struggling to recover from, frankly. And this sort of put paid to permanently, I think, in many ways, to the credibility of a revolutionary secular Arab Republican nationalism, the kind of Arab nationalism represented by Abdel Nasser, sort of died here and lost its credibility and its basic political legitimacy. He tried to resign. There was a wave of protests against that, so he didn't resign in the immediate aftermath. But I do think that this is the moment that opens the door for the birth of the Islamists, 20 years later, becoming a viable political power in the Middle East, everything from the Muslim Brotherhood to eventually, ultimately, Al-Qaeda, which has a much longer series of contingent events in Afghanistan and elsewhere that produced it. But the point is, it's precisely the failure of this dominant hegemonic model in much of the Arab world of revolutionary Republican nationalism that totally failed here, that opens the door for something else. And the conservative monarchies can still fall back on their traditions and their structures, but not so much in the Arab republics. And I think you can see in what bad shape some of them truly are. And some of that goes back to this the second catastrophe, a kind of political catastrophe for them.
So catastrophe on one hand,
Yeah.
and you can see in the eyes of these Israeli soldiers looking at the Western Wall a sense of awe and wonderment. This may be a picture taken by the famed and recently departed Israeli photographer David Rubiger. This was an instance, a moment at which political and religious aspirations were inextricably entwined. And to a certain extent, 1967 gives birth, both in the Palestinian and in the Israeli case, to this fusing of religious and political sensibilities.
Yeah.
The rise of Islamism on one hand, and the rise of a new, very powerful form of religious Zionism, religious nationalist Zionism on the other. Just to remind us of the map, on the left we see Israel and surrounding areas before the 1967 war. The picture on the right makes clear what territories were conquered. We see the Sinai Peninsula here, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank of the Jordan River, and the Golan Heights. One important question is, what is the status of these territories? Much of the world refers to these territories as occupied. Israel tends to refer to them as disputed. Do I have a... yes. I just want to jump ahead to this slide to clue us in. Much of the world believes that these territories are regulated by the norms of the 49th article of the Fourth Geneva Convention from 1949, which says that an occupying power shall not deport or transfer part of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. Now, interestingly, a couple months after the war, Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol asked the legal advisor to the Foreign Ministry of Israel, a man by the name of Theodore Meron, who, if anyone here knows, is one of the most renowned international jurists in the world. Was the presiding judge of the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Meron in 1967 said there was a categorical prohibition on settling civilians in these territories. Eshkol didn't heed that advice, and really every government from that point forward has believed that it is within Israel's right to settle civilians on this conquered land, based on the proposition that there were no clearly defined borders prior to the '67 war. The territories it occupied, especially the West Bank, did not come from a recognized sovereign state. No nation could lay clear claim to rights over these territories, and 1967 was a defensive war. So you will hear some or all of those arguments made by Israeli government representatives with reference to these territories. The overwhelming majority of the international community adopts a different understanding consistent with the 49th article of the Fourth Geneva Convention. You want to say something about this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we've been over it. We've basically been over this. I mean, there was further displacement, and 14,000 of the 300,000 displaced were allowed back into the West Bank, and it gives you a sense of, again, the further display, this sort of repetition of 1948 that was experienced in the Arab and Palestinian
repetition of a trauma, a deepening of a scar, reopening of a wound, as against another moment of not just relief, but exhilaration.
And also the crushing of an earlier narrative, which is that 48 happened because the Arab states weren't sufficiently independent, organized, determined, etc. I couldn't say that about 1967, so the political model failed.
Right.
With
So
dire consequences.
in Israel, there was an interesting range of views in the months following, quite apart from the deliberations over the legality of settling civilians in the territories. For some, particularly the Labor Party leader Yisrael Galili, the conquest of these territories was an opportunity to revive the pioneering spirit of Zionism, the ethos of reclaiming the land with one's own hands, a very powerful idea in the early Zionist movement. For others, generals, this act of conquest provided Israel with a necessary security buffer, especially if you look at how narrow Israel was prior to 1967 in this northern central part of the country. By having the West Bank, you gain, generals said, an important security buffer. The person on the top right, Israeli general and later defense minister Moshe Dayan, believed that this was an opportunity to deepen the strategic potential of the land by creating facts on the ground. Another very important and recurrent Zionist motif, to create facts on the ground, including both military and civilian. Curiously, the guiding personality, the founding father of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, was much more uncertain about the utility of these territories, and went on record in the immediate aftermath of the cessation of hostilities as saying that these territories might well become an albatross around Israel's neck, and said quite clearly in 1967 that if he could choose between peace and the territories, he would prefer peace. So he clearly understood, with the kind of strategic vision born of his extraordinary experience, that these territories might in fact be a liability moving forward. I will have to add that some saw this moment not just as the fulfillment of a divine plan, but as the beginning of the Messianic era. That the restoration, as it were, of lands included under biblical Israel to a sovereign Jewish state was a clear signal that the Messianic process had commenced. Okay.
The Arab world's reaction was absolute denial, and the adoption of the three no's of Khartoum, the Arab League Summit, September 1st, 1967, adopted this famous sort of denial statement: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. This was atrophied slowly over the years and was completely repudiated in 2002 by the Arab Peace Initiative, which has been updated now twice since then. Well, not only reaffirmed several times, but actually updated and increasingly clarified that it's not, as the Israelis keep saying, a fait accompli, but rather an opening bid, and certainly up for being negotiated and whatnot. But what the Arab Initiative says is that if the Israelis would withdraw from the territories occupied in 1967, with land swaps and other things that have been added, that the entire Arab world would have full diplomatic and trade relations with Israel. So it's a precise repudiation of the three no's of Khartoum.
And would you like to say a word about 242?
Well, yeah, I mean, 242 is crucial. It's the international community's response to the 1967 war, and it begins, it begins by emphasizing the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war and the need to work for a just and lasting peace. And then it calls for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. Now, you'll note the lack of a definite article. It doesn't say the territories, which would mean all of them. It says territories. Many Israelis have pointed to this to say, well, we get to keep what we want. The problem is the preamble emphasizes the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, which would seem to obviate the need for a definite article. Either it's admissible or it's not. So because there's no "the" there, suddenly it's admissible, which is a very
Though the French
strange
version
argument.
has a definite article.
The French version has the definite article, but the English version doesn't,
Yes.
so there you go. More importantly, the other side is the termination of all claims and states of belligerency. So what you have there is the origin of the land for peace formula. That is the basic way for resolving this conflict is for Israel to withdraw from territories occupied in 1967, content itself with the armistice lines of 1949, at the end of the 1947-48 war, and for the Arabs to give up the struggle against Israel and recognize it in peace and security. And that is essentially the basic idea. The Palestinian reaction was to essentially finally break away from the Arab states. The 1964 Palestinian Charter and the formation of the PLO as the first really comprehensive unified national entity after 1947 was done very much under the aegis of the Arab states, particularly Egypt. In 1968, the Palestinians regrouped, reformed themselves under the leadership of Yasser Arafat with the determination to seize control of their own decision making. And I'd have to say, if you want to give Arafat his due as a national leader, in spite of all his failings, which were myriad, he did manage to wrest Palestinian decision making away from the Arab states and get it entirely into Palestinian hands, where they have struggled mightily to try to keep it with limited success, but he managed to do that. They redrew their charter, saying that they believe in Arab unity, but right now they have to safeguard their Palestinian identity, right? That's in stark contrast to the kind of total identification of the first draft. Then there's a reconceptualization of the Jewish role. The Jews who had normally resided in Palestine until the beginning of the Zionist invasion will be considered Palestinians. Now that's vague. What was the Zionist invasion? Was it in the 1890s? Was it after the Mandate? Was it in 1947, 48? It's not clear, but it does make a distinction. It doesn't say you have to agree with our narrative to stay. It makes a distinction about when you were there. And then they did not offer citizenship to all Jews, although there's been an ongoing argument about the role of Jews in a future Palestinian state, with Abbas and Fayyad both saying categorically they want that to be an option, others saying they don't want it to be an option. The usual distinction is between Jews and settlers, that they all agree they don't want any settlers. Many are open to having Jewish residents or citizens. They doubled down on the idea of armed struggle. Armed struggle is the only way to liberate Palestine, and it's a fully secular document. It doesn't mention Islam or Muslims in any part of it, and it remains very much part of this secular pan-Arab idea with a very big, in fact a disproportionate Palestinian Christian political presence in the PLO at this time, especially in some of the more left-wing and radical parties, the PFLP and the DFLP.
So a pause before we conclude. We're in the heart of the statist era of the conflict, and yet the Palestinians here make a reappearance, and in the form of sort of the golden age of secular nationalism.
Exactly.
That associated with the Fatah faction of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Here we have briefly...
Yeah, the three main factions, Fatah led by Arafat, was very strong secular nationalism with pragmatism and hints of Islamic identity. He would do Islamic things without mentioning it much, without emphasizing it, but he would sort of pray and things like that. And two left-wing parties that were prominent at the time, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, led by George Habash, a Marxist, quite radical, engaged in hijackings, very strongly associated with kind of a pro-Moscow element, and really was very strongly Christian in many of its respects. And the DFLP, even more left-wing, a Maoist group led by Nef Hawatmeh, which broke with the PFLP and interestingly came together with Fatah in 1974 to introduce the two-state idea in a 10-point program about a phase for liberation that opened the door for the PLO to embrace a two-state solution after 1973. It's very important that that happened after
Right, though it's important to note that armed struggle meant violent action directed against Israel, and particularly, and including civilians. So this was also a period, this era of secular nationalism was also an era of sort of the age of spectacular terrorism.
Yeah. Also, I would say, to be very frank, where Palestinians identified in this spectrum and the other factions that were part of the PLO depended a lot on where they were from, what family they were from, what village they were from. There was something very clannish about all of this about Palestinian politics, and just to leave that out would be wrong.
Okay, let's move towards conclusion. In part because of that sense, again, of indignity which the Arab states suffer in the 1967 war, there's a very powerful desire to restore a measure of balance, political, military, and morale. And this is part of the thinking that inspires the Egyptians, led by its new president Anwar Sadat, to undertake a surprise military attack on Israel on October 6, 1973, which happened to fall, not coincidentally, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of prayer in the Jewish ritual calendar. The Arab forces, led by the Egyptians, made very significant forays into Israel, leading to very real fears that Israel could somehow fall and be forced to surrender to Arab forces. But Israel succeeds in pushing back the Arab forces. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there's a tremendous amount of national shame in Israel over the intelligence failure, the failure to heed intelligence reports that said an imminent attack, there would be an imminent attack by Egypt. Meanwhile, for the Arabs,
yeah, I mean, I think there were several things going on here. First, there's a real effort that succeeded to regain some degree of national and ethnic pride, some sense that they're not completely useless, and some sense that they can achieve militarily against the Israelis, and that was accomplished. Another thing was, I think it's clear that the war aims this time were a lot more limited, and the Arab states were thinking about trying to recover the territories lost in 1967 rather than trying to reverse the 1948 outcome, really was, I think, the war aim they had in mind. And finally, I think there's a real fascinating open question about what Sadat was up to. I mean, did he think he could really win? And I'm not sure he did. He was already interested in a couple of things that happened in the aftermath. Number one was tilting very strongly to the United States, and the other was eventually doing a deal with Israel to recover the Egyptian territory, all of the Egyptian territory lost in 1967. He may have calculated that in order to do these things, he needed to convey to the Egyptian public that they couldn't have done that without a deal through another war. That just wouldn't happen, no matter how propitious the war was. And to convey to the Israelis the necessity of doing a deal, because additional further wars might not go as beautifully as the other ones had if someone else took the initiative next time. And I think it's also interesting, the sort of very clever American diplomacy led by Henry Kissinger, that when the United States ended up sort of ensuring all the American goals, which were that Israel would be victorious but chastened, the Arabs would be defeated but not humiliated, the Russians would be engaged but as a secondary player, and the United States only would be in a position to talk to everybody about achieving what they needed. It was sort of a bit of a masterpiece.
Right.
Yeah.
So it would seem as if, certainly in retrospect, this was a key, if not essential, precondition to what will follow 5 years later.
I think it was
the restoration of a sense of national honor, and the lesson to the Israelis that this could be a world of ceaseless conflict. Both of those lessons.
I think it clearly was essential. The only question is, was it intentional on the part of Sadat? Right. We'll never know. I tend to think it was, but I don't know.
So we're going to move ahead, and I want to mention one final factor. This is our penultimate slide, I think, that was also key in the events with which we'll conclude, and that is the political upheaval in Israel. Israel from 1948 was ruled by one party, the Social Democratic Labor Party, led by the dominant figure of David Ben-Gurion. In 1977, Ben-Gurion's hated rival from the revisionist Zionist movement, Menachem Begin, was elected prime minister. His party, the Likud party, won the largest number of seats and was able to forge a coalition. Very interestingly, Begin, the classic Ashkenazi Jew, whose Hebrew was unmistakably Polish, appealed to the large and growing population of Middle Eastern Jews, known as Mizrahim. Those who felt a deep sense of resentment from their experience in the transit camps in the 1950s, which they associated with the dominant Labour Party. And finally, Begin, after running for prime minister for the entirety of the existence of the State of Israel, was able to galvanize the support of that disenfranchised Mizrahi population and win election as prime minister. His style was very different from that of preceding prime ministers. He was a masterful orator verging on demagogue at his worst, and had very different positions than the Labour Party, espousing a much fiercer line with respect to the Arab countries. And yet, it was he who became Anwar Sadat's partner in peace, sort of calling to mind the Nixon in China thesis that we are familiar with in American foreign policy.
So what you end up with at Camp David is an agreement between Israel, the United States, and Egypt, which essentially ends this period that we've been describing, the classic period of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The essential agreement is that Egypt recognizes Israel, and Israel withdraws from all of the Egyptian territory that was occupied in 1967. There's an annex about Palestinian rights, but it's not realized and wasn't ever, I think, fully expected to be realized. It was all done, I think, on a knife edge at Camp David, with Carter playing a crucial negotiating role. But I think the parties got essentially what they wanted. The Egyptians got their territory, their national pride, their national dignity back, and something they haven't lost ever since. The Israelis basically took the Arab conventional option off the table. With the Egyptians not part of the equation, the other Arab states could not consider, and have never considered again, the idea of a conventional war against Israel. So really, the Israeli struggle for survival in the region comes to an end here. And so they both got really essentially what they wanted. I think the United States very much got what it wanted as well.
And Carter, interestingly, the much maligned Jimmy Carter, saw the signs.
Yeah.
He saw that Sadat was ready on the basis in the aftermath of the 73 war. He saw that there may be a new opportunity with a new Israeli political player who was an unlikely candidate, but might well be willing to play a role in this historic process and convene these parties together. And the result was, for all intents and purposes, the cessation of hostilities between Israel and its Arab neighbors and the Arab states, bringing to an end that second phase in the conflict, the status phase, and inaugurating the third phase, which is the re-entry of the Palestinians into the story, which will await us in our next appearance.
Yeah, no, that's right. Now we're back to the two peoples in one land scenario. Also, there's a period of time following this where Egypt was ostracized temporarily from the Arab world, and this ended up costing Sadat his life at the hands of some very extreme Islamists in Egypt. And I think you can see this is one of a series of events that happened in the late 70s that opened the door for the birth of the violent Islamist movement we're dealing with now.
Right.
It's a minor factor, but an important one.
I would say that we've gone on longer than usual, but that's not exactly the case. We always go on long. But you've been a very patient audience, and I thank you very much, and we're now open to your questions.
Note from the
We'll get to your question.
information that you have, we have devoted an extra half hour to this, so you're on until 2. Questions?
This gentleman, yes.
Yes, I visited the Holy Land, Palestine, Israel on 3 different occasions.
Could you maybe raise your voice?
I visited the Holy Land on 3 different occasions, and we went with hands-on experience with the Israeli leaders, the Palestinians, and everybody else. And when I got there, I really felt that Israel was 100% correct until I got there. There's problems on both sides, for instance. But I believe that the Philistines were the indigenous people of the ancient Middle East. They were there for generations. And they got reasonably along well with the different cultures. But then I remember when I was in high school, my father and I went to the movie called The Exodus. And we saw that movement of thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people leaving the United States and going and settling in a land where these people were already living. They had no military. They have no power in the world whatsoever. And look at, for instance, how they're living today in the Gaza Strip. You know, there are people, children are dying. There's no food. There's no medical care. And the Israeli government has to raise the bar and be concerned about this, because you're never going to have a serious, any kind of resolution to this crisis unless the Palestinians' voices are heard and respected. What are they doing now? For the most, I don't believe in Hamas, don't believe that stuff, but it is self-defense to a certain extent. So if I didn't go on that experience, and I was with a rabbi, with a Muslim a cleric, myself, other
It has the makings of a joke. It has the makings of a joke.
I'm sorry. What's that?
Doesn't
Rabbi,
matter.
a priest, and it has the makings of a joke, but okay.
So it was
All right, I think
that came back. That's where I went into. But I hope next time you have a presentation that you'll get more involved with the Palestinian side of the story, and invite the people to come. I think you get the whole picture. Sorry, that's it. Yeah,
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you for addressing the demographics of how the UN divided the populations in what was supposed to be the Jewish sector in November of 1947, so that hadn't been addressed the first time. And I think it's amazing to think that what was going to be a Jewish state had about as many Arabs designated to be living in it as Jews. I just don't know how the UN thought that was ever going to realistically work out. The other thing I wanted to ask about, though, was I heard that the UN began to have second thoughts in 1948 after the catastrophe and the dispersal and so on of the Arabs. And the result was an assassination that I don't think either of you ever mentioned, either today or before, of Count Bernadotte, who was sent there to investigate and ended up being assassinated by Jewish terrorists.
Yeah, no, right, that's an important footnote.
Well, I mean, there are so many of these details that we just couldn't get to, but it is true that Jewish extremists greatly mistrusted the sympathy that the UN representative to the conflict, Count Bernadotte, had expressed about the Palestinian refugees and basically towards the Palestinian experience. And he was killed by the terrorist group that was led by future Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. This is a most unfortunate incident, and I'm afraid par for the course in this whole conflict.
Yes, Falk.
One thing I'm a little unclear of is you talked about in the mandatory period where the Jews were building up institutions, and when the UN decided to partition the land, they were prepared to declare a state. But there were two states that were named, and nowhere between November of 47 and May of 48 did anybody seem, from the Palestinian or the Arab side, to stand up and say, we're declaring the state of Palestine, we're going to accept this partition even though it's unfair, we're just going to step back and allow our brethren in the Arab world to move in and take over the rest of it.
Well,
I guess one of the great what-ifs is, why didn't they prepare for that, and what if they had taken the deal?
I did address that last time I was here, but I'll do it again, and I did so yesterday, interestingly, in Brooklyn. Well, they did, in fact, declare a state of Palestine, but they declared it in the whole of mandatory Palestine. They did not accept the partition land. So what if they accepted the partition land? And the question is, in hindsight, Wouldn't it have been wiser to do that and try to salvage what you could have salvaged and do it? And the answer obviously is yes. Of course it would have been the wise thing to do. I also think it's not something that, it's the kind of wisdom that no polity, no group of millions of people have ever shown in human history. To see that far, to be that prescient and say, well, this is a horrendous deal, nobody would ever take it, but let's take it because it'll be worse if we don't. A group of 1 or 2 people can do that. Millions of people in a political situation, I don't think can do that. And so I'm afraid the wise thing was not possible. I can't think of a single instance in human history where a large polity has made a decision like that.
It is true that there were some Palestinians who, in the immediate aftermath of the conflict and the Nocte, asked themselves this question.
Oh, sure.
That we have evidence of.
Oh, yeah.
But part of what I think we want to convey is that from the perspective of a Palestinian in January 1948, this was not a deal that they could accept.
No, it sounds crazy. Yeah.
It's very easy to say it makes sense in light of subsequent history.
Yeah.
But in that period, to accept 45% of the land when you're 2/3 of the population did not seem, I mean, it summoned up a sense of incredulity and profound unfairness. And that's, that is one of the truths that simply is irreconcilable with the fact that the Jews were desperate for a safe haven, needed a state of their own in order to provide for their displaced masses, and in fact gained that epical achievement in the very same resolution. That's part of what we're trying to convey, is that there's truth that lies in each of the narratives that the groups, in addition to fiction that is larded in, but they're competing rights as well. And this is one of those cases in which they are simply irreconcilable.
It is something that Palestinians have struggled with ever since. I mean, could we have, should we have, why didn't we, was it ever possible? They continue to struggle with it.
I want to just go back and say a brief word about Bernadotte. It was the most extreme of the Jewish paramilitary groups, the Lehi or Stern Gang, which many of whose members began in the Labor Party, and then in the course of the tumultuous and convulsive 1940s became infused with a kind of messianic sense of destiny. And it's they who engaged in the assassination of the British diplomat Lord Moyne and then later Count Bernadotte. There was a sense that they had to do all within their means, including even negotiating with Nazi officials to gain what was most desperate, which was a place of their own for the dispossessed Jews of Europe. There was tremendous mistrust on the part of the United Nations, on the part of Jews in general, and particularly that side of the political spectrum towards the United Nations, before and after the resolution decision. It's important to note that on the other side of the equation, the United States also expressed great concern in the early months of 1948 about the wisdom of a partition. By the way, Lehi did not support a partition at all. Lehi wanted the entirety of the land for the Zionist enterprise.
Plus
the United Nations and the revisionists wanted both sides of the Jordan River. The United States, in March 1948, wondered if, in light of the hostilities that had broken out, and in light of the recalcitrant opposition of the Arab side, whether partition was even possible. And they began to float the idea of a trusteeship in which the United Nations would essentially assume the place of the British. For a few weeks, that trusteeship idea lived on. So there was tremendous uncertainty, really on all sides, in that very violent period that followed the United Nations resolution. Yes, please. I'll get back to you, Mickey. I just want to get this.
You had mentioned that Czechoslovakia and France supported Israel during this time. When did America become really committed to Israel?
Beginning in the 1960s, yeah. Growing
up, we always, as Christians, kind of, we're always told, well, you know, we always support Israel because we're Christians, you know, or there's a big Jewish population in the United States. But really aligning with the Arab countries would help us more financially during this period. What and why did we, or do we, have such a commitment to Israel?
Right. So I think that's a big question that requires a long answer. And I'll try and be brief and therefore not do it full justice. The short answer is in the 1960s and between 67 and then 73 is when the support really begins to intensify. It's based upon the belief that Israel was a stable strategic asset, especially in a world divided into spheres of influence by the Cold War. B, a sense of a shared religious and political sensibility, the Judeo-Christian ethic. That language really begins to pick up in the 1960s and 70s, that Israel and the United States are not just strategic allies, but in a certain sense, partners in the Judeo-Christian project. And both are informed by a similar set of scriptural inspirations. Remember, the United States, our founding fathers, were deeply rooted in the Hebrew Bible, as indeed were Israeli political leaders, you know, who saw the Hebrew Bible as really the historical deed of the Jews to the land of Israel. I would say the dominant factor, though, was Israel's importance as a key player in the version of the Cold War that played out in the Middle East in the latter half of the 1960s through the 1970s. Mickey, yeah.
Dave, Palestine, though, will not recognize Israel as a state independently, will they? I mean,
well, not exactly. Not exactly.
Correct,
We see an interesting counterintuitive set of events in the late 1980s. In 1987, after having been, in a certain sense, the forgotten actors of history, and yet reemerging after the conclusion of hostilities between Israel and Egypt, the Palestinians in the West Bank undertake an uprising in 1987 called the First Intifada. This was a clear signal to the Palestinian leadership, which was not in the West Bank, but was living quite comfortably in Tunis, that they better get going and represent their people better. In the following year, 1988, Yasser Arafat, for the first time ever, recognized the State of Israel. That then commenced or set in motion those back-channel negotiations in various Scandinavian capitals that led to the Oslo peace process, the most memorable photographic image of which is President Carter literally forcing together Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn in September 1993. Interestingly enough, the Palestinians continued in that process to declare their willingness to recognize the State of Israel. Rabin, who I think could have sealed the deal had he not been assassinated on November 4th, 1995, never called for a Palestinian state. He acknowledged the Palestinians as the sole legitimate representatives, the PLO as the sole legitimate representative.
Let me just correct the record a little bit, both of you. The core documents, the founding documents of the Oslo process are the letters of mutual recognition of 1993 between a letter from Arafat to Rabin and a letter from Rabin to Arafat. And these are the core documents between Israel and the PLO. The letter from Arafat to Rabin commits the PLO to recognizing Israel and its right to live in peace and security, full stop. So the PLO, which is the sole representative of the Palestinian people, even Hamas accepts that, has recognized Israel, in fully recognized Israel since 1993. The letter from Rabin to Arafat, Israel recognized the PLO as a legitimate interlocutor, full stop. So in fact, and in reality, and in diplomatic legal fact, the Palestinians have recognized Israel since 1993.
I would say since
recognized,
88.
sorry, 1993, exactly. And Israel has recognized the PLO as an interlocutor, but never formally recognized a Palestinian state, or indeed the Palestinian right to a state. It's implicit in all the negotiations, but not explicit. But the recognition of Israel is explicit. And we were talking about possible changes to the Hamas charter yesterday. The thing to watch for is when they accept existing Palestinian treaty obligations,
I
which is the 93.
add something
letter.
about the possible future of the conflict, which we'll come back and talk about the third time. It seems to be a time of near total stasis on the political and diplomatic front. And yet, there are a number of factors in place that could lead to interesting change. One is the security alliance between Israel and a number of Sunni states, which Hussein knows a great deal about, which in a certain sense reverses the sequence that many of us thought might actually unfold. Many of us thought that there'd be a Palestinian-Israeli agreement, which looked quite promising for a brief spell there in the 1990s. And in the wake of that, a natural security alliance would ensue between Israel, Saudi, the Gulf states, Jordan, and Egypt. In fact, what we see is that security alliance now may be a causal factor in edging Israel and the Palestinians closer to the table. The other factor that's important is that, at least in my reading, this is a period in which the Palestinian cause has really descended to the bottom of the ladder in terms of the interest of the Arab world. There's a lot that occupies the Arab world today, beginning with Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and much else.
Well, overwhelmingly Iran. Iran is the key to all of this.
And Iran, but not the Palestinians.
No.
And that sense of being forgotten, I suspect, is having its effects on the Palestinians on the ground. Now, one unsubstantiated piece of evidence of that is what Hussein just mentioned. Hamas, of all people, whose 1988 charter, the same year that Arafat actually declared for the first time that he was prepared to accept the state of Israel, is rather blood-curdling and filled with anti-Semitic canards, it needs to be said, has apparently been working on a new charter that redefines the struggle, even away from the language of the Fatah, the secular nationalist charter, by saying it is not directed against the Jews, it's directed against the occupation. And for the first time ever, Hamas says, and we are prepared to live in a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. Now, the third factor, in addition to this security alliance and sort of the fact that the Palestinians seem to have been forgotten, is the 45th President of the United States, about whom I have very little positive to say. But it's exactly his mix of seeming indifference, ignorance, and bravado claims to deal-making that could force players on the ground to think differently about their relationship to the United States and one another than we thought. And I'm not saying that it's likely to happen, that we will see an historic resolution to Israel-Palestine under the 45th president. I'm only saying we should be prepared, we should be ready if things begin to change on the ground.
You never know.
You never know. I think we have time for a final question. Yes, sir.
You spoke about the West Bank. What dynamics were at work by virtue of the fact that the West Bank was originally part of the Hashemite kingdom?
Well, it was claimed by Jordan, but the Palestinians who lived there never really accepted, and they were Jordanian citizens, but they were not enthusiastic about it, and they continued to think of themselves in terms of Palestinians. So really, I think the most interesting long-term dynamic is the distinction between the political culture in the West Bank and the political culture in Gaza, which was ruled by Egypt during the 1950s and 60s. And in Egypt in the 50s and 60s, the Muslim Brotherhood was a fringe movement, a persecuted movement, etc., and really was allowed to operate more in Gaza than in Egypt because it was considered remote, far away, uninteresting, unimportant, etc. And the work of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza set the stage for the rise of Hamas in the late 80s, and then since then to a position of actually trying to compete with the secular nationalists in the PLO and the PA for national leadership. And so that there's no cultural or national distinction between the West Bank and Gaza, but there is a difference in religious and political attitudes where the people in Gaza tend to be more religiously conservative and have been more receptive to Hamas. Now, I'm not sure that given the misrule of that group over the past decade or so, there hasn't kind of atrophied that support, but still, the biggest, I think the biggest long-term impact has been the creation of slightly different political cultures in Gaza and the West Bank because of the Jordanian versus Egyptian experiences.
Yeah, and I would say that the political culture of Amman is very different from the political culture of Ramallah.
Yeah.
And the political culture of Palestinian Israelis, Palestinian citizens of Israel, is different from the political culture of Palestinians in the West Bank. To add an additional layer of complication.
Yeah.
It is interesting to note that in 1953, I think it was, the Jordanians attempted to annex the West Bank and incorporate it legally under its auspices. That act was rejected by the entire international community,
and everybody,
beginning with the Arab League,
yeah.
Which never accepted that, therefore adds a certain air of complexity and uncertainty around
They've renounced all claims. And by the way, one of the things you can dispense with right away is any Israeli idea that the way to solve this problem is to have Egypt responsible for Gaza and Jordan responsible for the West Bank.
The so-called three-state solution.
This is great from an Israeli point of view, but the three others who won't agree are the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and the Palestinians. And I can assure you they will never agree to it.
Other than that, there's a lot of agreement.
3 out of 4 is pretty bad.
Well, are you ready? Are you ready for chapter 3? We can't leave it at this. Maybe we'll have some good and bad movement, so we'll be back. And I hope to see you all on